Hello everyone. Tonight we will gently step into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, where justice was not truly to protect what was right, but to carve terrifying messages in blood, fire, and fear. Imagine this torchlight flickering against damp, cold stone walls, the clinking of iron chains echoing, and crowds pressing together just to witness the final moment of a human life turned into a public spectacle. Trust me, if you think modern life is stressful enough, you would never survive if you were thrown into that era. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I really love the feeling of being connected with all of you from different places. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are letting yourself sink into the steady rhythm of the narration, like the sound of wind slipping through a crack in the door on a cold night. And together, we begin our first story. A name familiar to anyone who has ever heard of Scotland's history, William Wallace. Picture this at the end of the 13th century. Scotland was like a small room seized by its giant neighbour. That neighbour was King Edward I of England, known by the nickname Hammer of the Scots. He built garrisons, replaced officials, collected taxes, and turned the Scots into subjects on their own land. In this bleak setting, a young man from minor nobility, Wallace, dared to rise up. His initial motive sounds almost ordinary. His beloved, Marion, was killed by an English official. A personal tragedy sparked a national storm. A strange, little-known fact. Many accounts say that after killing the official, Wallace didn't just flee, he rallied the villagers to follow him. Their weapons were not finely crafted swords and spears, but sickles, hammers, even kitchen knives strapped to sticks. Exactly like the saying, when rage is strong enough, even a spoon becomes a weapon. And with these upgraded kitchen weapons, Wallace and the peasants won the historic Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where the mighty English cavalry was crushed simply because they crossed the bridge out of step. Historians still debate a gruesome detail: did Wallace truly take the skin of the English commander Hugh Cressingham and turn it into a sword belt? Some chronicles insist he did. Others claim it was just exaggeration for symbolic effect. Whether true or not, the tale shows how the Middle Ages turned people into political messages. And, jokingly, if you think buying a fine leather belt today is expensive, back then there was a far more terrifying limited edition. After the victory, Wallace became a symbol of resistance. But you know, once someone becomes a symbol, they soon become a thorn in the enemy's side. Edward I set a huge bounty on Wallace's head. In the end, he was betrayed, captured, and brought to London. His trial was more of a performance than justice. He was mocked with a crown of oak leaves like a parody king. And when accused of treason, he retorted, "I never was a subject of Edward," a sharp reply that still echoes today. Now imagine the execution at Smithfield in 1305. Wallace dragged through the streets, hanged but not killed outright, then forced to witness his own body, tormented step by step. But we won't linger on bloody detail, for you are listening to sleep, not for nightmares. Just remember that in the end, his body was cut into parts and sent across Scottish towns like mobile billboards of English power. Ironically, that cruelty only turned Wallace into a martyr in the people's eyes. A reverse advertisement Edward surely never intended. Now close your eyes a moment, as the tone shifts gently. From the damp, cold lands of Scotland, we move to France, where a 19-year-old girl, a simple peasant, shook all of Europe. She is Joan d'Arc, or as we know her, Joan of Arc. Imagine yourself at that time, just a village girl in the midst of the 100 Years' War, and one day you hear the voices of angels and saints telling you, "My child, lead the army to drive out the English and crown the Dauphin." Sounds like a superhero movie plot, doesn't it? Except this was real life. The official historical record is clear. Joan played a key role in the victory at Orléans in 1429. The image of a girl in white armor, holding a banner, riding at the head of French soldiers, reversed the entire army's spirit. Soldiers, weary and despairing, suddenly believed God was with them. And indeed, the French won. A little-known fact: during battle, Joan was once struck by an arrow through the shoulder. Normally, you would collapse and call for a medic. But this teenage girl pulled the arrow out herself, quickly bandaged the wound, and returned to the field. That sight made the whole army switch to battle mode. To joke a little, Joan was like a medieval streamer. Her mere presence could flip the mood of thousands. Historians still debate whether Joan truly saw angels, or whether it was only imagination fueled by powerful faith. Some suggest neurological visions. Others insist it was divine encounter. But either way, the undeniable fact is that spiritual power changed the entire course of the war. When Joan was captured and sold to the English, a long trial followed. The charges sounded very religious heresy. Witchcraft. Even wearing men's clothing counted as crime. It shows how, in the wrong time and place, wearing jeans could send you to the stake. Not just earn criticism for bad fashion. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace at Rouen and burned alive before the crowd. As the flames rose, she called out God's name to the very end. The executioner later confessed he had never felt so haunted burning a human being. And just like Wallace, Joan's death did not kill her spirit. It made her a saint. Canonized century later. A plot twist that left even her executioner tormented afterward. We shift again, this time to Italy of the 13th century. The central figure is Conradin, a boy of 16. The last prince of the mighty Hohenstaufen line. He had everything noble blood, the right to inherit an empire, but that made him the target of both the Pope and King Charles of Anjou. The historical record is clear. Conradin led his forces into Italy to reclaim the throne, but was defeated at the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268. Betrayed and captured, he was brought to trial, and unlike Wallace or Joan, Conradin did not resist fiercely. He knew he would die, but still walked calmly to the scaffold. The strange detail few notice is that as he was about to be executed, Conradin removed his glove and threw it into the crowd, as if to send a message. Remember how I died, and avenge me. An act at once tragic and very Hollywood. If you think about it, historians still debate the political meaning of this death. Some argue it marked the beginning of the weakening of the Holy Roman Emperor. Others see it as nothing more than a show of force by the Pope to protect his power. Either way, the public execution of a young prince shocked all of Europe. 3 deaths, 3 figures, 3 stories, but they all share a theme: sentences that did not just kill people, but killed ideas. Edward I wanted to kill the spirit of Scottish resistance. The Church wanted to extinguish the image of a saintly girl, daring to challenge authority. Charles of Anjou wanted to prove that royal blood could not save anyone who defied the Pope. But as you see, time proved the opposite. Wallace is immortal in Scotland's memory. Joan became the holy protector of France. And Conradin, though dead, became a symbol of long-lasting hatred toward papal power. And if you are still awake at this hour, perhaps you also see something remarkable. People can be cut down, burned, or dismembered, but ideas cannot. The idea of freedom, of faith, or of justice may be crushed temporarily, but in the end they return, stronger than before. One last joke before we close this passage. If the Middle Ages had social media, these executions would have gone more viral than any cat dance video on TikTok. Imagine the comments. Is anyone live streaming? Share the link. Surely it would have topped the trending list. You gently close your eyes, letting the story fade into the air like fire dying out in the night. Those horrific executions are now only distant memories. Yet their silence after centuries still echoes in humanity's mind. And perhaps, as you drift into sleep, you too may dream of standing in that crowd, not to tremble, but to witness how history turned fear into undying belief. You ease your breath, let it grow steadier, and the story flows on like an endless river. The strange thing about medieval executions lies not only in their brutality, but in how they were turned into a kind of theatre. Yes, you heard right. Executions were like public performances, with scripts, audiences, and of course the main actor, the unfortunate condemned. Take, for example, the execution of William Wallace you just heard. The official record is clear: he was hanged, disemboweled, quartered, and his body parts sent across the land. But few know that Wallace's head, after being placed on London Bridge, was first lightly boiled before display. The process was called parboiling, boiled with herbs to preserve it longer. It sounds almost like a cooking recipe. But don't worry, this is not culinary advice. It only proves that even execution had its own professional preservation techniques. Historians still debate this detail. Was it done simply to keep the head from rotting too quickly? Or did it have ritual significance? Some suggest it was meant to turn the head into an eternal symbol of punishment. But think about it today. If someone put an enemy's photo on a highway billboard, would passers-by shudder? Or just scroll their phones indifferently? In every era, psychological impact was what rulers aimed for. Only the tools changed. Turning to Joan of Arc. The official history is well known. She was burned alive at Rouen in 1431. Yet there is a curious detail few mention after Joan's death. Her ashes were ordered to be scattered into the Seine, to prevent people from collecting them as relics. But soon after, rumors spread that small bone fragments, or charred scraps of her clothing, had been secretly preserved as treasures. Seen through modern eyes, this was a medieval fandom. No matter the ban, admirers sought to keep mementos of their idol. The great debate among historians lies in the authenticity of these relics. Did someone truly keep Joan's remains? Or was it all legend, crafted to fuel French resistance? Some scholars even suspect the story's amplification was deliberate propaganda, turning political defeat into spiritual victory. And indeed, as you see, Joan went from heretic to saint. If that isn't the greatest media triumph of all time, then what is? Then comes Conradin, the 16-year-old prince. The historical record is clear in 1268. He was executed in Naples, ending the Hohenstaufen line. But few know that before he fell, Conradin sang a hymn in Old German, moving the crowd to tears and utter silence. They say that song was like a farewell, turning the execution into a public funeral for an entire dynasty. If you imagine the scene under dim yellow torchlight, it would feel like the closing sequence of a tragic film. And of course, scholars could not ignore this detail. Some believe Conradin truly sang. Others argue it was a fabrication added by German chroniclers to heighten the pathos. But one act is certain: he threw his glove into the crowd. And if you picture it, today, if a famous footballer were unjustly penalized, the image of him throwing his jersey into the stands would be remembered with the same symbolic meaning. History often repeats itself in small gestures like that. On a deeper level, those public executions teach us one thing: power always seeks to control through fear. Yet there was a paradox rulers never foresaw. The more brutal they were, the more they gave their enemies the chance to become symbols. Edward wanted Wallace to be a cautionary tale, but he became a legend of resistance. The church wanted Joan forgotten as a heretic, but she became the holy protector of France. Charles of Anjou wanted Conradin erased, but he became a haunting memory for centuries. And perhaps you are smiling softly, because hearing this, we too can sense the irony of history. Power sometimes acts like a clumsy playwright. The more carefully they stage humiliation, the more the audience weeps in sympathy. A perfect plot twist, isn't it? One light joke to help you sleep. If the Middle Ages had a Netflix chart, these executions would surely rank in the top 10 hottest shows of the week. And perhaps the audience would gossip. Have you watched it yet? The ending plot twist is insane. Clinking a mug of beer instead of popcorn. You slow your breath, letting your mind settle. And we continue the story, gentle but detailed, like listening to a whispered history book as a lullaby. Tonight, we'll dive deeper into William Wallace, how he rose up, how his movement spread, and then move on to the next story of a French peasant girl who also turned faith into a weapon. Picture this: Scotland at the end of the 13th century was not a land at peace. People were forced to pay taxes. English officials sat proudly in power, and castles were filled with guards in gleaming armor. Meanwhile, villagers bent their backs in the fields, and if they displeased the rulers, they could lose an entire harvest. In that world, William Wallace, the son of a minor landowner, could not bear to see his country trampled. Many accounts say Wallace's beginning was not an instant grand uprising, but a series of small acts of defiance. He gathered a few dozen loyal friends, and gradually expanded into an armed band. You might picture it as a kind of resistance, start-up, little capital, few members, but plenty of passion and bold ideas. The spark that ignited everything was the killing of the English sheriff William Heselrigg at Lanark. According to some accounts, Heselrigg had killed Wallace's beloved, Marion, though the details are unclear. What is certain is that Wallace and his band struck Lanark and killed Heselrigg inside the courthouse. This was the turning point. From an outlaw, Wallace suddenly became a rebel leader, hailed by the people. Word spread so fast that soon peasants from everywhere began to join. Picture the Scottish countryside then. Peasants abandoning their ploughs, sharpening them into spears, blacksmiths setting aside hammers to wield maces. Even kitchen knives tied to poles became weapons. It may sound naive, but those homemade weapons gave the rebellion its character, turning helplessness into uprising. If TikTok had existed then, there would surely have been a trend called "from kitchen to battlefield," turning household tools into weapons. One major historical event that marked Wallace's rise was the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. He, along with Andrew Murray, chose the perfect spot, a narrow bridge across the River Forth. When half the English army crossed, Wallace ordered the attack. Imagine heavy cavalry, used to dominating wide plains, suddenly trapped like cars in a traffic jam at rush hour. The result: the English were routed, and the commander Hugh Cressingham killed. A curious, grim detail after this battle. Some say Wallace took Cressingham's skin to make a sword belt. Historians still argue fiercely. Some dismiss it as exaggeration meant to emphasize brutality. Others accept it as truth, since multiple contemporary sources mention it. Either way, the story became a symbol, a vivid message that oppression's shame had been skinned on Scottish soil. Seen in modern terms, it was Wallace's shock value media campaign. The victory at Stirling shook all of Scotland. Wallace was named Guardian of the Realm, And here's another curious detail he used: the Royal Seal of England captured in battle to sign diplomatic letters. People call this legal forgery, or in today's words, fake it till you make it, pretending to have authority until the world believes you really do. But not every battle was won. The Battle of Falkirk in 1298 was a bitter defeat. English longbowmen from Wales rained arrows, while cavalry broke through, shattering Wallace's forces. Afterward, he disappeared into the shadows, no longer leading directly. But in that retreat, Wallace began to transform into a living legend. For 7 years, he lived as a fugitive. The thorn Edward I could not pull out. If hashtags had existed then, surely Wallace Unstoppable would have spread through every Scottish village. Another strange detail during his years in hiding: some records claim Wallace travelled as far as France to seek support. Some say he even met the French king, hoping to forge an alliance against England. The evidence is murky, and historians still debate whether the journey truly happened. But if it did, then Wallace was not only a rebel leader, but also an accidental diplomat. Finally, in 1305, he was betrayed and fell into English hands. Taken to London, Wallace was put on trial. And as you already know, it was not a fair hearing, but a political stage. When accused of treason, he answered firmly, "I never was a subject of Edward." That line still echoes today, a declaration of sovereignty more powerful than 1,000 pages of diplomatic documents. The execution at Smithfield became a tragedy, but also the moment Wallace rose beyond being just a man and became a symbol. That brutal death, instead of silencing, only fanned the flames of resistance. Robert the Bruce, who later secured Scotland's independence, learned from Wallace's lesson that freedom could be crushed in the body, but never in the idea. You see, from Wallace we follow a thread leading to another figure, also of humble birth, also young, also daring to challenge authority, Joan of Arc. If Wallace was the sound of swords clashing at Stirling Bridge, then Joan was the hymn echoing across the battlefield of Orléans. Shift the scene from the cold Scottish Highlands to the fields of France in the early 15th century, where the 100 Years' War had turned villages into wastelands. In that setting, a 13-year-old girl heard the voice of angels. That calling not only changed her life, but altered the fate of France itself. And now you are about to hear that story, a journey where faith became a weapon, where a young peasant girl became the symbol of a nation. Picture France at that time. The 100 Years' War had torn the land into a broken chessboard. The north had fallen to the English and their Burgundian allies, while the south clung to the banner of the French crown. Ordinary people suffered, waking each morning not knowing if they would face English soldiers, Burgundians, or French, all of whom could seize grain, take cattle, or burn homes. If you think surviving daily traffic jams today is exhausting, imagine living through that true survival mode on the highest level. Joan was born in Domremy, to a simple farming family. But at the age of 13, she began hearing strange voices. According to her later testimony at trial, they were the voices of the Archangel Michael and the saints Catherine and Margaret. They told Joan that God had chosen her, an illiterate girl, to liberate France from the English and to place the Dauphin Charles on his rightful throne. Sounds like fantasy, doesn't it? But to Joan, it was not fiction. It was a divine mission. A curious detail often overlooked: neighbours recalled that Joan, though a young girl, they were so trusted that people left their flocks in her care without fear of losing a single sheep. One tale even claimed her sheep were unusually obedient, as if influenced by their sacred shepherd. Historians, of course, debate this. Some call it exaggeration to build her legend. Others believe it reflects the villagers' genuine memory of a remarkable girl. And then, Joan began to act. She convinced a local commander to let her approach the Dauphin Charles. At first, everyone thought she was mad. But when Joan accurately predicted a French defeat, the infamous Battle of the Herrings, people began to wonder perhaps God really was speaking to her. And so Joan was given a horse, armor, and an escort to meet the Dauphin. That moment must have felt like a film scene. A village girl, who had never wielded a sword, now clad in shining white armor, carrying a banner of God, boldly walking into the royal court. They say Charles tried to test her by hiding among the crowd, not sitting on the throne. But Joan walked straight to him, knelt, and said, "You are the one chosen by God." A twist that left the entire court stunned. The official historical record is that Joan directly contributed to the liberation of Orléans in May 1429. The French army at that time was exhausted, morale nearly gone. But Joan appeared, crying out that God was with them. People saw a young girl on horseback, banner flying, and suddenly they believed victory was certain. In one battle, Joan was struck in the shoulder by an arrow. Everyone thought she would fall. But she pulled the arrow out, hastily bandaged herself, and returned to the field. That image spread through the camp, and soon after, Orléans was freed. Historians still debate, did Joan truly command strategy, or was she simply a spiritual symbol? Some sources claim she joined in military councils and suggested bold ideas. Others argue she was only a flag of inspiration. Either way, it cannot be denied that after Orléans, Joan became a phenomenon. In July of the same year, Joan accompanied the Dauphin Charles to Reims, where he was crowned King Charles VII. Picture it inside a Gothic cathedral. A peasant girl standing beside the throne, holding her banner, while the king wore his crown. It was nothing less than a message from heaven. France had been chosen by God. But glory did not last. In 1430, during a clash at Compiègne, Joan was captured. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 gold coins, an enormous sum. And from there, the story turned dark. The trial at Rouen in 1431 was one of the most detailed proceedings of the Middle Ages. More than 100 clerics and lawyers attended. They did not just want to kill Joan. They wanted to destroy her image. So they brought charges that sounded both absurd and dangerous: heresy, witchcraft, and even wearing men's clothes. Yes, just because Joan wore armor and soldier's clothing, it was deemed against God's law. If Joan had shown up today on Instagram with the hashtag number OOTD, outfit of the day, she surely would have been reported for not fitting the fashion norms of the time. The strange thing is that throughout the trial, Joan answered with remarkable intelligence. When asked, "Do you believe you are in God's grace?" she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." A reply that avoided both traps the court had set. Historians and theologians still debate, how could an illiterate peasant girl respond with such sharpness? Was it natural wit, or truly divine guidance? Even so, the political pressure from the English was too great. In the end, Joan was sentenced to death. On May 30th, 1431, at the square of Rouen, Joan was led to the stake. Witnesses said she wore a simple white dress. Her head was shaved, and her lips kept calling on God until the fire consumed her. The executioner later confessed he had never felt so haunted, convinced he had killed a saintly soul. The English wanted no relics left, so they ordered Joan's ashes scattered into the River Seine. Yet rumours spread that scraps of cloth or bits of bone had been secretly preserved. True or not remains debated. But once people believe in a symbol, no fire can burn away that faith. The result was that Joan's death did not extinguish her spirit. It transformed her into the Maid of Orléans, Century later, the church canonized her, turning the 19-year-old once called a witch into the holy protector of France. Do you see the pattern? Both William Wallace and Joan of Arc share the same essence. They were not just people, they were ideas. Wallace was cut to pieces, but his soul remained tied to Scotland's cry for freedom. Joan was burned, but her faith became an eternal flame for France. And it is for this reason that, when we turn to Conradin, the young German prince, you will see once more how history repeats its paradox. Rulers seek to destroy their enemies, but in doing so, they unwittingly raise monuments to them. Do you notice how smoothly the story flows? From the homemade weapons at Stirling, to the banner embroidered with the cross at Orleans, and soon, to the glove Conradin hurled into the crowd at Naples. All remind us that some deaths do not end a story, they begin a legend. Lean back a little more, close your eyes, and imagine church bells echoing in the distance, mingling with the sound of hoofbeats descending from the Apennines. We are in Europe of the 13th century, where a boy of only 16 carried the weight of a dynasty and was swept into a tragedy with no escape. This is the story of Conradin, the last young prince of the Hohenstaufen line. You know, the Hohenstaufen dynasty once ruled over much of Europe. Conradin's grandfather, Frederick II, was given the illustrious title Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. He was both warrior and scholar, fluent in many languages, and a man who kept popes awake at night with worry. But when Frederick II died, that vast empire began to fracture. Conradin's father, King Conrad IV, died when he was still a child, leaving the throne dangling like a prize ready to be seized. Conradin grew up in a castle in Bavaria. Picture a 16-year-old boy, blonde hair, bright eyes, raised to believe that in his veins flowed the blood of emperors. And yet when he looked beyond the castle walls, he saw only a land carved up, Germany divided, Italy lost. The new ruler of Sicily was Charles of Anjou, backed by the Pope. Yes, you heard right, the Pope, instead of playing mediator, became the political kingmaker, determined to snuff out the Hohenstaufen line. The official historical record shows that in 1267, the few remaining loyal Hohenstaufen knights wrote letters urging Conradin to march into Italy to reclaim the crown. Those letters are still kept in the Vatican archives, sounding like disparate cries. Conradin, though young, decided to act. That was the turning point. From a boy in a castle, he became the heir to a long and bloody struggle. A little-known detail along the way into Italy. Conradin was greeted in several cities like a savior. People hated Charles of Anjou for his harsh taxes and cruel rule. So even before Conradin had proved himself, the very name Hohenstaufen was enough for gates to open. It's like today when a new singer debuts. If they carry a famous family name, attention comes twice as fast. But true power comes from more than a name. Charles of Anjou was a seasoned strategist, blessed by the Pope, funded with French gold, commanding veteran troops. Conradin, by contrast, had only a few thousand German knights and a handful of Italian allies, men who despised Anjou but weren't necessarily loyal to the Hohenstaufen. Historians still debate, did Conradin truly grasp his weakness? Or was he blinded by early signs of support? Perhaps both. In the summer of 1268, Conradin entered Rome. Crowds hailed him as their deliverer. It was the peak of his brief life. But on August 23rd, at the fields of Tagliacozzo, everything collapsed. At first, the German knights smashed through Anjou's lines, nearly capturing Charles himself. Conradin thought victory certain. But it was a trap. Charles unleashed hidden reserves that struck from behind. The Hohenstaufen army broke and scattered. A strange detail survives in the chaos. Conradin tried to rally his men, Some sources say he even removed his helmet, showing his youthful face, to inspire courage. Instead, it stunned many. Their would-be emperor still looked like a boy, struggling to shoulder a burden far beyond him. Defeat at Tagliacozzo turned Conradin into a fugitive. With his loyal knights, he fled across the Apennines, hoping to reach the coast and sail to Pisa. Those days must have felt like a nightmare trek mountains. Enemies in pursuit, dwindling food, and then came betrayal. An Italian noble, Giovanni Frangipane, pretended to offer shelter but delivered them to Charles of Anjou. Betrayal, as history's recurring specialty, had arrived at the worst possible moment. Conradin was taken to Naples. Instead of being killed immediately, he was put on trial. This was unprecedented. A legitimate king, heir of emperors, paraded before a public court. The charges were familiar rebellion, usurpation, insulting the Pope. But think about it. Could a 16-year-old boy, who had never truly ruled, really have committed all those crimes? Some say it was all theatre, staged to legitimize the elimination of the Hohenstaufen line. A little noted fact throughout the trial. Conradin remained calm. Witnesses recalled he neither cried nor begged, but simply stated that his right came from his grandfather, Frederick II. Facing an entire political machine, the boy clung to tradition, power through bloodline. But historians point out that the age had shifted. It was no longer simple feudalism. It was an era where popes and kings wielded law as weapons of politics. Conradin, though right, had no chance. On October 29th, 1268, in the square at Naples, a scaffold was built. Thousands gathered in silence, broken only by the wind. Conradin stepped out in plain clothes. No helmet, not sword. Before kneeling, he removed his glove and hurled it into the crowd, saying it should be given to his kin, so they would know he died as a knight. Historians still debate, did this glove-throwing really happen? Or was it legend added later for drama? Either way, it became a symbol. That small gesture cast Conradin as a tragic image, a boy meeting death with dignity. When the blade fell, it was not just one head severed, an entire dynasty ended. The Hohenstaufen line, once mighty across Europe, was extinguished. But the consequences were not what Charles of Anjou had hoped. Let's look at the years that followed. The people of Sicily hated Angevin rule so much that in 1282 they rose up in the revolt known as the Sicilian Vespers. They massacred thousands of French soldiers and settlers on the island. And in the furious shouts of that day, the name of Conradin was still invoked, a reminder that his blood had not yet been avenged. Poets and writers across Europe did not forget Conradin either. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, alluded to his death as proof of papal greed. In the 19th century, German romantics even turned Conradin into the symbol of the beautiful loser. You see, sometimes dying young allows someone to live much longer in human memory. So we have travelled through 3 lives, 3 deaths: William Wallace in Scotland, Joan of Arc in France, and Conradin in Italy. Each was killed to deliver a message: defy the king and be dismembered. Defy the church and be burned. To defy the political order and be beheaded. But ironically, brutality only made the message of resistance endure longer. Think about it. Wallace became a legend of independence. Joan was canonized. Conradin became a tragic emblem. Power can kill bodies, but it cannot kill memory. And those memories whisper across centuries. So that tonight, as you listen to this voice, you can still feel their echo. And here is the third little joke to make you smile before you sleep. If the Middle Ages had social media, these 3 would be the biggest influencers. Wallace with hashtag number freedom or death. Joan with number chosen by God. And Conradin with something simple but haunting number, the last prince. Close your eyes now and let the story fade, like distant evening bells. The violent deaths are now only shadows, but the lesson remains clear. The strength of belief and the human longing for freedom always outlast the sword, the spear, or the flame. And perhaps, in your dreams tonight, you will see them, these three young figures, still riding, still carrying banners, still walking within humanity's immortal hope. You are still here, listening, and together we go one last step, gently, like a candle that burns brightest before it dies away. After hearing the violent ends of Wallace, Joan, and Conradin, now it is time to bind them into one larger picture, a picture of power, fear, and the immortality of memory. Notice this, all three were so young. Wallace was not yet 40 when he died. Joan only 19. Conradin just 16. Their lives were short compared to those who condemned them, but that very brevity preserved their images in purity, untouched by age or compromise. History remembers them forever in that form. Wallace with his sword, Joan on horseback with her banner, Conradin throwing his glove to the crowd. The historical record shows that in the Middle Ages, public execution was a spectacle of power. It was not only punishment but a stage. Rulers wanted the masses to see, with their own eyes, the cost of defiance. But they hardly realized that these death stages would accidentally turn the condemned into the leading actors of a timeless tragedy. A curious fact often overlooked: many of those execution sites later became places of pilgrimage. Scots prayed secretly beside Wallace's scattered remains. The French whispered stories about scraps of cloth from Joan's pyre. Sicilians carved Conradin's name into folk songs. Strange perhaps, but human beings always attach holiness to the forbidden. And the more something is banned, the more sacred it becomes. If today a video is deleted from the internet, you can be sure millions more will rush to find it. Historians still debate a deeper point. Did these deaths truly change history? Or only the way history is told? Some argue that even without Wallace, Scotland would eventually have found another leader. Without Joan, France would still have recovered, thanks to politics and economics. Without Conradin, the Hohenstaufen line was already fading. But others insist that these individuals did alter the course of events, and perhaps that very debate is itself part of their immortality, that their names still provoke argument centuries later. Reflect on this. Political power always seeks to control through fear, but fear only works for a moment. Memory then turns it into fuel for defiance. Edward I hoped to terrify with Wallace's dismembered body, but the Scots revered him as a martyr. The Church tried to extinguish faith with the fire of Joan's pyre, but she became the holy maiden of a nation. Charles of Anjou tried to sever the Hohenstaufen root, but Conradin became the symbol that fueled Sicilian revolt. From a modern perspective, one lesson stands clear: ideas are stronger than punishments. You can kill a body, but you cannot kill collective memory. That is why these stories still live today, and why you, in the quiet of the night, are hearing them again. And one last joke to ease you into sleep: if these three figures lived today, they would each have millions of followers online. Wallace would post DIY weapons from farm tools. Joan would live stream from the battlefield with the caption, "Faith is power." And Conradin would run a fan page called Teen Prince Against the World. And who knows? Perhaps you would like and share their posts too. But returning to reality, what matters most is not the tragedy itself, but the light shining through it. Wallace shows us that courage can spring from personal loss. Joan proves that faith, even if dismissed as delusion, can reshape a nation. Conradin reminds us that calm dignity before death can itself become an eternal message. Now, close your eyes gently. Let all sounds fade away. Those three figures, a Scottish warrior, a French maiden, a German prince, though divided by language and culture, together send across time the same message that some things cannot be killed by whip, sword, or flame. They are freedom, faith, and honor. And if one day you feel life too heavy, remember this. There were people who stood on the scaffold and still held their heads high. In the end, we are far more fortunate. We do not need swords or pyres to prove ourselves, only the strength of conviction and patience in our hearts. You shift slightly, as if the chill wind of the Middle Ages still lingers after hearing the tragic tales of Wallace, Joan, and Conradin. But you know, those three executions are only the tip of the iceberg. The Middle Ages had a whole arsenal of punishments so varied that simply hearing them can send a shiver down your spine and yet fascinate. For each punishment was not just a way to kill, but a social, political, and religious message. Picture it a wide stone square, townsfolk crowding as if for a festival. And at the center, a scaffold. It wasn't always hanging or burning. Sometimes authorities invented other spectacles to terrify. A clear historical fact: hanging was the most common punishment for thieves and murderers. Simple, quick, and easy to carry out. But few know that in many parts of Europe, after the hanging, the body was not taken down immediately, but left for birds to peck. Passers-by would see the grisly sight, and remember, don't steal chickens, or you'll end up as food for crows. A strange detail in Germany, there was a punishment called the breaking wheel. The condemned was bound to a wooden wheel and had each limb smashed. Then the wheel was raised upright for the whole village to see. Horrific. Yes. But for the townsfolk it served as a living poster of justice. Historians still argue whether the wheel was widely used or reserved for only the gravest crimes. But if it existed, it was truly a form of outdoor advertising in the Middle Ages. And then there was burning at the stake. Joan of Arc is the famous example, but she was far from the only one. Burning was often used for heresy, those who went against doctrine. People believed fire would purify the soul. If that sounds familiar, you're right. It's like pressing the delete key on a computer, wiping everything clean. Only instead of data, it was applied to human beings. Another lesser-known punishment, the gilded cage. Some lords did not kill enemies outright, but locked them in cages, hung high above city gates, so everyone passing by could see. In England, there are records of prisoners left so long that only bones remained. Think of it in modern terms. A kind of billboard announcement declaring this is the fate of traitors. Historians debate the real level of cruelty. Some say many accounts were exaggerations to frighten. Others believe they truly happened, as legal records describe them in detail. Whatever the truth, it is clear that medieval people didn't just punish, they turned punishment into a form of communication art. Now imagine another scene in a small village. A petty thief, say. Someone stealing chickens might be tied to a post for the townsfolk to throw rotten tomatoes and eggs. Yes, public shaming. They called it the pillory or stocks. The culprit's head, hands, and feet locked into wooden frames, helpless against jeers and stones, quite literally. If social media had existed, this was the medieval version of a comment storm. In some places, the ducking stool was used for adultery or witchcraft, tying the accused to a chair, dunking them in water to see if they floated. If they floated, they were guilty, aided by the devil. If they sank, they drowned. You see, medieval law was often a game with no winning condition. Play, and you lose. There were also punishments more symbolic than deadly. For instance, shaving the head and parading the person through town, often for traitors or adulterous women. Today we'd call it image shaming, but back then it meant a lifetime of disgrace. You see, the treasury of medieval punishments was vast, from burning at the stake, hanging, the breaking wheel, iron caches, to public shaming. All of them shared one trait: they turned punishment into a performance for the crowd. And the irony, as I've said from the beginning, is that these shows sometimes failed. Instead of sowing fear, they sowed the seeds of legend. Wallace, Joan, Conradin are only three famous examples. There were countless others who turned the scaffold into a stage of immortality. And, to ease your breath a little, here's the second joke. If public shaming still existed today, then the crime of littering would probably see many people standing in stocks on the street. And who knows? Someone might even live stream it for fun. Tomato throw 10 likes. Rotten egg throw 20 likes. Just imagining it makes you pity the offender. You see, every medieval punishment, from hanging, burning, to the wheel or the stocks, I had one thing in common. They were not just to kill or punish an individual. They were staged as a public play, with hundreds or thousands of people as the audience. The rulers wanted to wield fear as a weapon. But the paradox was, the more public, the easier it was to turn the condemned into a symbol. A historical fact in England, France, Germany, major executions were often scheduled on fair days. When crowds gathered, people would shop and then conveniently watch a hanging. Records show that in London, once, the crowd pressed so tightly during a hanging that the railings broke. A curious detail few know in many cities. Street vendors took advantage of executions to sell food, bread, wine, sweets, just like fans at a football match today. Indeed, the scaffold was the Netflix of the Middle Ages, horrifying, yet entertaining. Scholarly debate. Some historians argue that public executions effectively maintained order, frightening people from crime. But others claim the effect was the opposite. Many were drawn by the blood and fire, seeing criminals as rebellious heroes. In other words, the scaffold was both a place of deterrence and a seedbed of resistance. Picture Wallace dragged through the streets of London, Joan on the pyre at Rouen, Conradin throwing his glove into the crowd in Naples. The crowd may have trembled at that moment, but what they carried home was the image of a defiant figure. And then that memory was passed on, turned into story, then into legend. In modern society, we have social media, with news spreading in seconds. In the Middle Ages, they had no internet, but they had oral tradition and collective memory. And that memory endured longer than any online article. What is notable is that brutal punishments often left religious echoes. The Scots secretly prayed before Wallace's scattered body parts. The French saw Joan as a saint only hours after she was burned. The Sicilians composed ballads about Conradin, public executions. Instead of engraving the power of kings or popes, engraved the immortality of the condemned. Do you see the paradox? The ruler wanted to erase an individual, but the very cruelty turned that person into an undying symbol. Edward, I wanted Wallace to vanish, but he became a legend. The church wanted Joan forgotten, but she became the Maid of Orleans. Charles of Anjou wanted to end the Hohenstaufen, but Conradin became the symbol of the beauty of failure. And when you look at other bizarre punishments, you see the same paradox. A chicken thief shamed in stocks, pelted with tomatoes and eggs, but often people remembered his hardship and retold his story for decades. A woman ducked in water, the villagers half believing, half doubting, The image became a tale of injustice. The law mocked. A historical fact in many regions. The ducking stool turned into comedy. Sometimes villagers dunked the condemned, up and down not to judge, but to entertain, like a fairground game. A strange detail in Germany. There's a record of a man locked in stocks, but instead of being stoned, he was given beer. Because the villagers liked him, the tool of deterrence suddenly became a place of merriment. Scholarly debate. So were public punishments truly effective? Or were they merely a social stage where people vented emotions to this day? The answer remains divided. You breathe slowly, noticing that all of this gives us a lesson about power. Power can command, can kill, can build stakes or breaking wheels, but power cannot control how people remember. And it is collective memory that truly shapes long history. Think about today, we still tell the stories of Wallace, Joan, Conradin. We still shudder at the breaking wheel or the iron cage. But the names of many governors, judges, or executioners, they have sunk into oblivion. Who is truly immortal, the rulers or the condemned? The third joke to help you sleep: if the Middle Ages had YouTube, surely the execution videos would be trending #1 with titles like "You won't believe what happens next." And of course the comments section would be full of debate, some condemning, some cheering. Yes, not so different from today. In the end, those gruesome punishments, on the surface tools of rule, through time turned into stories, showing that true strength lies in memory, in how people choose to remember. Wallace, Joan, Conradin, and countless nameless others turned death into eternity. You close your eyes, let the voice fade like distant church bells. In the dark, you see them: a Scottish warrior, a French maiden, a German prince, standing together, not as criminals, but as symbols. And the lesson they leave behind is perhaps also a lullaby. For you, human strength lies not in power, but in memory. Imagine yourself walking into a medieval city, the cobbled road uneven, taverns and forges lining the sides, crooked wooden houses leaning. But in the middle of the square, the most striking sight is not a palace, not a church, but a wooden scaffold, ready for executions. It was as if part of the urban landscape, like bus stops or streetlights today. Hard to believe, but true in medieval life. The scaffold was an ordinary presence. That shows punishment was not only to penalize individuals, but a communal ritual, a dark ritual that nonetheless bound people in a shared experience. Villagers came, both to satisfy curiosity and to feel safe seeing the criminal destroyed. Some even treated it as a lesson for children. Look, that is the price you pay if you misbehave. If today we have cartoons teaching morals, back then they had live outdoor executions. A historical fact in Paris, in the 14th century, the Montfaucon gallows was the largest execution site. It was built solidly of stone, able to hang dozens of corpses at once. To save time and amplify terror, people from nearby regions considered watching hangings at Montfaucon a kind of outing. A strange detail: sometimes executions came with trumpets and drums to make them more spectacular. Records even show that in some places, tickets for good seats were sold, like a theatre performance. If it still existed today, surely there would be popcorn and beer combos for the crowd. Scholarly debate. Some historians argue that crowds truly enjoyed executions as entertainment. Others claim many were genuinely horrified, and it was fear itself that worked as deterrence. So what was the truth? Perhaps, like watching a horror movie, some laugh with delight. Others cover their eyes in fear. Beyond the public side, there was also a religious layer. Medieval people believed punishment was not only to frighten, but to save souls, burning heretics. In their logic, purified sin with fire, hanging criminals, then leaving bodies to the crows, was returning the filthy body to nature. In that context, execution carried a moral cloak. But the paradox appeared: the more cloaked in morality, the more the cruelty showed. They thought they were helping souls, but in truth they planted more tales of injustice. And from there, the condemned became saints, became symbols of resistance. Let us step deeper into punishments, less about killing, more about shaming. Stocks and pillory, wooden frames for public confinement, hands, feet, head locked, face exposed to ridicule. At first, people laughed. Threw tomatoes. But sometimes, as in 15th century Germany, villagers pitied the culprit, bringing food. A punishment of shaming turned into a public charity campaign. Branding, pressing hot iron. Thieves marked with a T on the forehead. Adulterers with an A. Wherever you went, you carried your profile on your face. Compared to today, this was the ancestor of being permanently tagged on social media. Shaving, public head shaving. Women who committed adultery had their hair shorn and were paraded through the streets. Today, a shaved head can be a bold fashion. But in the Middle Ages, hair was honor. Lose it, and you lost social standing. Ducking stool, dunking chair. This punishment was more performance than justice. The crowd roared as the culprit was dipped up and down, like a fairground show. Some scholars say it was a serious tool to test witches. Others argue it was simply malicious entertainment for the community. We return to the breaking wheel. One of the most haunting punishments. The criminal's limbs broken one by one, then the body tied to the wheel raised high, like a billboard of flesh and bone. Passers-by forced to look up. A little-known detail in some cases. People believed if the condemned survived the blows, it meant God protected them. Suddenly, the punished became a saint in people's eyes. See the paradox. A tool of terror accidentally created living relics. And then the iron cage, gibbeting. The body left dangling, battered by wind and rain. The intent was to burn the warning into memory, but later, many villages saw it as a landmark, and children dared each other to visit. A warning sign turned into a horror attraction. But you know, all those punishments, no matter how cruel, could not stop one thing. People always found ways to turn pain into stories. And once it became story, it no longer belonged to rulers, but to the people. Wallace, Joan, Conradin, they are the clearest proof. Their deaths became ballads, legends, and those bizarre punishments, through centuries, turned from tools of control into narrative material for us to understand both human cruelty and resilience. Think about tomorrow when you wake. You will go to work, to school, or simply out for a walk. You will not see stocks in the square, nor cages hanging at the gate, but the stories remain, reminding us that power may sow fear, but collective memory is what endures. And if you ever feel modern life too harsh, remember, at least you don't risk tomatoes thrown at you in the market for forgetting to pay for a chicken. Yes, that's a gentle joke to help you relax before sleep. You close your eyes. Let the voice fade like thin smoke. Images of stakes, wheels, K's blur away, leaving only the idea death may end a life, but cannot end the story. And it is the story that walks alongside humanity forever. Sleep peacefully, as if shielded from the cold medieval winds, so that when you wake, you feel stronger. Calmir. And far luckier than those who once lived in that age.